Hi, I'm Julie Mead. I'm a designer and have been for many years. And it was several years ago, I learned a great technique from my friend Linda Satgast on creating realistic shadows. Since then, I have studied lots of other techniques, but this one is by far my favorite shadow technique when working on a flat surface, as if you are looking at it from above, which is what we strive to achieve when creating digital layouts. I have to admit, my family and maybe even you might think I'm just a little bit different, but I love looking closely at Pixar animated movies just to study the way they use light and shadows and even textures. High definition television makes this so much more intriguing. The first time I saw the movie Cars in high definition, I was amazed at the details. The black road had so much texture in it, and the light reflected off of the car along with the realistic shadows. I was so intrigued by the attention to details. Well, I know this is really hard to believe, but that was about 14 years ago. After that, I really started paying more attention to shadows and how they actually looked on my layouts. So let's take a closer look at these two pieces of paper taken in full sunlight outdoors. First, let's notice the direction of the light. It's coming from the top and angled down to the right. And the reason we can tell this is because the shadows are down here and seem to be pulled down toward the right edge. The paper on the right looks pretty flat, but as we study the shadows, we can see along the bottom that it does not lie on flat. It's not lying completely flat. We can see where the shadows are pulled slightly away, and then we can see where the shadows move in. So as we go along the bottom, the shadows move in and out. This shows us that this paper is not completely flat. It's a part of it is up a little, raised up a little bit, and some of it is a little bit closer to the ground behind it. The wrinkled paper on the right really dramatizes this point. We can see what areas might be further away from the background. We can see that this corner is really close to the ground, and then it gets lifted higher, and this part must be pretty high off the ground as it's pretty lifted, and then we come right back down to an area where it's very close again to the background. Also notice the lack of shadows. On the top and on the left side, there's no shadows there. And that's because as the light comes through, it's pushing those shadows behind that. So that's really important to remember when you are creating your own shadows. So today, I'm going to teach you how to do this kind of a warped, like this bottom edge, realistic shadow on your layouts. I'm going to show you how to do this with the latest version of Photoshop. And I'll show you what to do if your version of Photoshop cannot do all of these steps. First thing I want to do is to show you how you might already be using the drop shadow layer style. And I'm also going to show you some quick tips and some fun things that you can do. So let's take a look at my first image here. And I'm using the word art, blue sky. I'm using the word blue sky, and I've already got some shadows added to these. So let's take a look here at the one at the top. And we're going to take a look at the drop shadow and what it does and how, and the different options that I've picked for this. So to open it up, you just have to double click on that layer, and it might be a right click depending on the mouse that you have. So we're going to, you can also always choose, I'll close this out for you. You can also choose layer, and then you can go down to layer style, and then you can choose the drop shadow down here at the bottom. And then that will open up with the drop shadow for you. So let's go ahead and look here at your different options. And those of you that already are really familiar with this option and you use this a lot, we're just going to kind of briefly go over this, and maybe some things that you haven't tried you might want to be trying sometime. Of course, with the blend mode, you can change this blend mode, and when you do that, the shadow is actually going to you can tint it, and you can also have it interact with the background. So for instance, if I change it to an overlay, then the shadow is going to kind of pick up some of that blue and then react with it, the color that is behind it. But I almost always keep mine on multiply. You can also change the color of that shadow, tint it. So I've got kind of a red tint going on here, but I'm going to cancel that and I'm going to keep it black. Usually when I am working with opacity with my shadows are pretty soft, and I would normally keep my shadow under 50, even closer to maybe a 40%. But today I want to keep this shadow rather high so that you can see what I'm doing. If I get it too soft, I don't think you'll be able to see it too well. So I'm going to keep that up here in the 70s just for now for this class that I'm teaching you. Let's look at the angle. I almost always use the top left as my source of light coming down, but you can change that angle too. Maybe you always like to use the top right. Sometimes it depends on the photo that I'm working with. If the photo shows that the picture has the light coming from the top right, then I will probably make my shadows coming from that direction. But if that's not really obvious, then I'm going to keep my shadows coming from the top left. Now you're going to want to make sure that you use the global light option, so check that. That will make sure every layer, when you add a shadow, will have the very same angle so that they will all be the same, and you want your shadows to be the same. We also will use distance and size. Now, opacity, distance, and size kind of all play together. Distance, of course, that just is how far away you want it from your background. Okay? And I'm going to keep this one fairly close. I very, very seldom use spread. And when you use spread, that just makes it look a lot darker and more pronounced, the shadows. You can see it's pulling that shadow and making it denser. And then on size, that will soften up your shadow. Kind of make it a bigger, softer shadow. The contour, you probably won't want to play with that, but you can get some really fun effects with that, especially when you are working with word art. You might want to, I'll just show you, oops, let's show you some of them. With the drop-down tool here, this drop-down window, you have some different fun effects. So, you know, you can get kind of this look here by playing with these different contours of your shadow. Some of them are fun and will really create some unique shadows for you. So you can play with those. But for what we're doing today, we're really not going to need to change the contour at last. The last thing I want to say about layer shadows is this plus sign. So I'm going to back out of that one, and I'm going to go down here to this bottom one. And as you'll notice here, I've got 3 different shadows added to this. So I want to open this up, and I want to take a look at these 3 shadows that I have down here. I'm going to have to make each of those visible to you. There we go. All right, I'm going to hide all 3 of those. It's kind of fun that, you know, what you can do with that. So I created this first one where I have this strong blue drop shadow coming out of it. And I used 100% opacity on that drop shadow. Then I added the next drop shadow, which was a purple. I changed the color, and it is at 100%. And it's a little bit bigger distance. And the size of it is pretty, you know, you can make that smaller or bigger depending on what you want to make with that size. And then I added an actual drop shadow behind that, a black one, so that I could give it a realistic drop look, a shadow look to it. So if you want to have a lot of fun with those shadows, you know, you could even on one of those shadows add a contour. Oops, I keep picking that one by mistake. There we go, this one. You know, I could do a little contour to that, do something a little bit different to one of those shadows, and you do get some really fun looks here. So those are just some options for you if you wanted to play around with the different drop shadow options. There might be something you've never tried, or maybe you have tried them, or maybe you never tried them in this way. So anyway, we've got different ways that you can use those shadows. Now, the last thing that I want to do is really get into the technique where you get a lot more control over your shadows. So let's go ahead and use that drop shadow option, layer style that we have. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to open up my layer styles, and I'm going to pick a drop shadow. Now I still have those three showing up here, and I'm going to pick one and I'm going to have to adjust it. So I'm going to pick this one, and I'm going to bring that shadow down, the opacity down a little bit. I'm going to bring the distance down a little bit, and I'm definitely going to bring the size down quite a bit. I want it probably about 12, 10 would be good. And then I'm going to raise that shadow a little bit. Now again, I am keeping the opacity pretty dark here for you so that you can see what I'm doing. But if I was really making a layout, I would really keep this down below 40, around 43 probably is what I would keep that at. So we want to play with this shadow. So I'm going to choose OK. And now I've got this drop shadow layer, but I really can't do anything special to it the way that it is. So what I want to do is I'm going to hold down the control button, and I'm going to click on those words, that layer style drop shadow, and a drop down window opens up, and I'm going to go down to create layer. And if you do get this window open, just click OK. And now when you look back over here on your layers palette, you will see that you now have a separate layer for the drop shadow. Now you need to make sure that you are on that layer, so click on that shadow layer to activate it. We're going to go over here to the smudge tool. Make sure you choose the smudge tool. We're going to make sure that you want to make sure that you choose a soft edged brush. We want to choose normal mode, and the strength needs to be down in the 30s. 34, 35, 36, somewhere in there. Now, let's go back here and look at this paper. We've got a drop shadow. We don't have much over here on the left, a little bit of shadow right there. But as we look at this, we need to decide what might be actually closer to the background and what should we pull away from the background so it looks like it's lifted more from the background. Right away, I always like to kind of pull my corners out a little bit so they get a more of a lift up here in the corner. So we'll work a little bit on the corners here. I'm going to make my brush large. And I am going to be very careful with pulling that out. Okay, I might make it a little bit smaller. I don't want to just grab it and pull it because that will warp my shadow and it'll make it look, fake. So I'm just going to very carefully, it even gives you uneven edges along it if you get too rambunctious with them. So I'm going to pull that out just a little bit. And I think that this area right here might be a little bit closer. So I'm going to pull this edge back in a little bit. Pull that back in just a little bit. This area right here, I feel like it's going to be closer to the background, so I'm going to pull that shadow in. This area might be raised a little bit, so I'm going to pull that shadow out. And you can see as I go, I decide on how much I want to pull in, and I also want to decide on the size of my brush. And I just use my left and right brackets to enlarge my brush or decrease my brush on how carefully I want to do that. And it's not a tedious process, but you want to go slow and you want to be careful. You don't just want to go in there and grab it and pull things out and push things in. You want things to look as real as possible. So I just go through along the edge here and decide what I want to be further away and what I want to be closer, and to pull that shadow in so it gives it more of a realistic look. So I would just go around and pull things in, or maybe lift things away, corners especially. Then I pull other areas back in. Now when you're done working with it, I like this corner over here. I definitely would raise that so it looks like it's coming out and away. This little shadow needs to come out too, along with this one. I think this one would look a little bit more further from the edge. So I'm pretty happy with that. It's pretty dark, so I would lighten that shadow up quite a bit by lowering the opacity of that to make it look a little bit, to make it look more realistic. I could even work with the shadows in here by pulling them in. But I would suggest that you take it slow, you look along the edges, and you work around the edges with your shadow to create as much of a warped look, so that it looks uneven, that the paper doesn't look like it's just a flat piece of paper, because it's not. Here's another way that you can do this very same technique, but I'm going to do it with my with a sunflower that I have here. We're going to do the very same technique, except it's for people that don't have that option where you can create a new layer from that drop shadow. So we're going to activate that flower layer, and I'm going to duplicate that flower layer by hitting Command and then J, and I'm going to bring that layer below it, and I'm going to rename it Flower Shadow. Now I'm going to hide that original flower layer, and I'm going to be working with this flower shadow. And I want to turn this into a shadow, so this is just a really quick and simple way to turn it black. I go to Image, Adjustment, and then I go to Hue, Saturation, and I just turn it all the way from the lightness to dark, all the way dark. And I click OK, and there I have my shadow. But this shadow has a lot of really hard edges to it, so I would come up to Filter, Blur, and then I would go to the Gaussian blur, and I would choose somewhere between 5 and 6. You don't want to overdo this blur on it. You want to keep it between 5 by 5.4. That's usually a good number that I like. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and I'm going to turn my sunflower back on, and you can see behind it that shadow. Now you can go ahead with the choose V to get the move tool, and then you can drop that shadow out and away with your move tool. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold down the Shift key, and I'm going to use my arrow keys by moving that to the right and then the down arrow so that it comes out just a little ways from that. You can hold the Shift key, or you can do it without the Shift key. The Shift key will be a bigger jump, and without the Shift key you're just barely moving it. So you want to move it over to the right and down a little bit. Now the opacity is 100%, and that's pretty dark, so again you're going to want to bring that shadow down quite a bit. You know, 40%, right around in that area. I do want to say though, when you're working with shadows, it's not always a set rule. You're going to be thinking about your background and looking at it and adjusting it as you go. But just remember, you want to go toward the lighter side of that shadow than the darker side of that shadow to keep it realistic looking. Now that we have our shadow in place, we can actually now go to the smudge tool that we were using before and do exactly like I was showing you before with the same settings. And you can pull your shadow out and down. You can pull some of it in. This, I actually think that some of this is just too far away. So you have you know, you can play with this and get more proficient with it as you play with it. But you know, look at your picture and think, well, where's the shadow really going to be pulled away from it? And where will the shadow actually be closer? Where will it be closer and where will it be farther away? One other last technique, fun thing that you can do with your drop shadows is to go over here to the Edit, Transform, and then you can choose either Warp, Distort, or Skew, and that's another one that you can also use to pull your shadows out, especially something like a flower where you might want to actually pull the sunflower part of it farther away. So let's look at how we could use skew in something like this. So I would just take it and I can pull it away. I can use these. I can pull it back up into there. So you can get a general idea of how you can play with your shadows by using that transform option with the skew, the distort, and then I really like using the warp, because the warp you can work with just certain areas of it that you might want to. Anyway, so that gives you a couple of different options of how to use the technique that I showed you today. Is how you get a lot more control over your shadows by using this technique where you're actually working directly with the shadow and not just adding it. Hope you enjoyed this and maybe learned some new techniques with drop shadows. Thank you.